Welcome to another episode of Alan Fixed It. This is a little project car that I picked up. It's a 2002 Mitsubishi Lancer. Has about 120,000 miles on it and has a blown head gasket, it seems. So today I'll be taking off the head, inspecting it, seeing if it's just a head gasket, or if there's a crack in the head or something like that. I'm hoping it's just a gasket. Should be a pretty easy fix. We'll be doing the head gasket and the timing belt, water pump, and everything of that nature, if that's just the case. So, first things first, we're going to have to obviously disconnect the intake and exhaust manifolds as they're connected to the head. All the wiring harnesses and things around. Pretty self-explanatory to that degree. This video will be more focusing on some of the more technical aspects of removing the cylinder head, as far as getting to the head bolts and things like that. Obviously the valve cover has to come off so that you can get to those bolts. And then we'll do a video on the head gasket job itself, and then a separate video on the timing belt job, so that if you're doing either of those, this video should help you through that. Step one, anytime you're doing anything around the engine compartment or around the front bumper, always a good idea to remove the battery. To remove the battery in this one, it's just two 10mm nuts here and here. We're just going to disconnect that and take that out. Alright, next step, battery's out. We're just going to start disconnecting things from this valve cover and from the head itself. So right now we're going to be doing 10mm bolt to get the throttle cable off, and then just disconnecting these vacuum lines and the bolts for the coil to be able to get all of those wiring harnesses and everything off of here. Now, the factory service manual, as well as some other places, will have you believe that you need to take the entire wiring harness off of the head. I'm going to try to do everything that I can to prevent having to do that. Theoretically, I should just be able to disconnect these things, lay them out of the way, and leave the intake manifold intact without having to release the fuel pressure, hopefully. I'm just going to move everything out of the way, try to disconnect it as best as I can, and just kind of pry the exhaust away and the intake and push it back just to give me enough room to work in here. Shouldn't be too terribly difficult. So, like I said before, I just unbolted those coil packs, popped them out, laid them off to the side over here, and unplugged them on either side as well. The plugs just kind of hanging out on either side. Disconnecting these vacuum lines from the valve cover, and then this part of the wiring harness that comes across here, there is little tabs right here that if you pull up on, you can slide that harness off all the way around. That one's upside down, but you get the idea. All the way down, and then disconnect it from the power steering reservoir right here. Power steering pump, excuse me. And then I'm just going to lay this up and out of the way so that it's not in anybody's way. Also going to disconnect here, of course, and then, like I say, down here. And then this whole wiring harness will just lay back, and I can lay it up here against the windshield, maybe use some zip ties to hold my throttle cable, as well as any vacuum lines or other wiring harnesses that might be in my way. Alright, so we've got everything out of the way. Disconnected. There's a few more of those clips on that wiring harness. I just did it to give myself a little more room. Tucked everything back so that we can get to all those little bolts that hold this valve cover on. And next we're going to remove this upper timing cover. 10mm bolts again. Everything we've done so far has been 10mm bolts. We should be able to get this upper timing cover off without disconnecting the motor mount. We'll see. I'll undo these bolts and we should be able to pop this off. And then we're there. We should be able to get this valve cover off pretty easy. Alright, just 4 bolts held that on. It wasn't difficult to get off at all. Now we're just going to take the valve cover off and go from there. So we're just going to take these small 10mm bolts off all the way around, and we'll be able to see what we're dealing with a little bit better at that point. Alright, our valve cover is off. So if you look down in here, you can see the head bolts. So those little 10mm in the around the edge. But we can't go cracking those loose just yet. So now that we're at this point, we've got the timing belt exposed, at least the top part of it. We've got the valve cover off. Now comes the real fun. We're going to jack this up. We're going to drain the radiator. And then we're going to disconnect here, where this thermostat housing looks like goes in. And then the exhaust manifold. We're going to have to take off the accessory drive belts, disconnect, it looks like, at least the power steering pump from here, because the bracket is connected to the head. Oh, I misspoke. There's the thermostat housing. So then we're going to disconnect all this right here and get all this out so that we can take this head off. And then of course we've got to get to the back side as well and disconnect the intake manifold and any of those related parts. So at this point, I'll walk you through it, but I'm going to drain the radiator. There should be a drain plug in the bottom, and we'll go from there. Alright, quick note, just to give myself some extra room here to get to all of this, I went ahead and removed the air box. There was 2 10mm bolts. Mine had nuts on the back side. I don't know if yours will. Here, and then there was 2 longer 10mm that held it here. I unplugged the wiring harness to it and disconnected it at the main inlet hose there and just pulled the whole thing out. That gives me an enormous amount of room to get back here. I'm going to finish working on getting this wiring harness out of the way and then drain that coolant like we talked about. So I'm just going to be disconnecting all these sensors and wires and peeling this back. Right, so I've got most of these nuts off of the exhaust manifold. Just note that the bottom right and the bottom left are 14mm. The rest should be 12. Now I've got all of this unplugged over here. I'm going to leave this attached as I pull it out, and then we'll just take this sensor off before we take the head to the machine shop so it doesn't get damaged in their hot tank procedure. Right now I am in the process of taking out the power steering pump. In order to do this, you have to release the belt, first of all, by relieving this or loosening this nut down here on the idler pulley, and then loosening the nut on the back side down there until you can slip the belt off. Now there's 2 bolts that hold the power steering pump on, one on the top, one on the bottom. I'm just getting the second one off. We're going to take this pump out and see if we can figure out a way to get this bracket off, because it's very peculiar. There's no bolts holding it that I can see, but we've got to get this bracket off because number 1 is attached to the head, and number 2, it's guarding that nut down there. So I'll let you know. Alright, it looks like this bracket is held on by this bolt here, and then one slightly lower. Can't really get a good angle of it here, but It's like, you can kind of see it. Looks like it's right behind this pulley. So I'm going to get this one off and then go to this one and see if that relieves our pressure on this bracket to get this bracket out of the way so that we can finish this job. So those 2 bolts in the front were holding that bracket on, but it looks like there should have been bolts on the outside holding it in as well. So somebody's obviously been in here and not done a very good job. So when we put her back together, we'll make sure that we have all the correct bolts and go from there. Now from this point, we are going to take this last bolt off of this exhaust manifold, pull it backwards away from the head. So now that we've got the exhaust manifold loose, on the underside of the car there's a little strap that's held on by one 14mm bolt. We're going to take that off, and that should give us enough room to pull this exhaust back and kind of out of the way. So we have removed all of our nuts and bolts that hold the intake manifold to the head, cylinder head here. And we have successfully left everything else intact thus far. Haven't had to take the fuel line apart or anything like that. Now, in order to give us some more wiggle room, there is a bracket right there that has 2 bolts. They look like 14mm bolts that hold the intake manifold in place against the motor. So what we're going to do is take those 2 bolts out, and that should give us enough room to push that intake manifold back out of the way. Okay, so intake manifold is off and separated. And then the last piece is, there's a little T-fitting right here for your heater core lines that you will have to disconnect those 2 hoses. And then once we disconnect these radiator hoses here and here, I'm actually just going to pop this one off right here. So we've got our intake manifold off. I also disconnected our thermostat housing. I went ahead and just disconnected it straight from the head, since we're going to be taking this head in again in a hot tank. I didn't want to damage any sensors or anything like that in the process. So you might want to just take it off here. I decided to take it off there. You don't want to pull it too hard because you'll separate it from that hard pipe, the crossover pipe. I just did it just enough to break that loose, and then before we put it all back together, we'll clean it up and put some more silicone on that. And then I went ahead and just disconnected this here. I'll leave that on since there's no sensors in it. So the next part of the puzzle is we've got to get our motor to top dead center and take this timing gear off. The way the factory service manual says to do it is we'll get this to top dead center and then zip tie the belt onto it. That would be one way if you were planning on keeping your timing belt in components. I don't know why you would. If you're doing a head gasket, I'd recommend just replacing your timing belt, water pump, and everything, since you have to take it apart anyway. But that's completely up to you. We'll zip tie it just for ease this time, and then we'll redo the timing after it's all back together. Alright, so we've got this at top dead center. So as you can see, our nipple and our dash are lined up. And then see if I can get you a good image down here. So see if I can get it to focus in. There we go. So there's a T on that down there, and there's a notch in your harmonic balancer or your crank pulley. In the video it doesn't look like it's lined up, but it's lined up from what I can see down here. I'll see if I can get a better image. There we go. Anyways, you get the idea. You get a T and a notch, and you line them up. Alright, so at this point, what we're gonna do is zip tie that belt to this right here through these loops so it doesn't move, and we're gonna break that nut loose. There's a special tool you're supposed to use to do it. I don't have that special tool, so I'll just be bracing it with a pry bar to bust it loose. Alright, so we've got our cam gear zip tied so it doesn't move on us. I've already broke the bolt loose and taken it out. So now we have to carefully pop that off and set it to the side. The tensioner in there should hold enough pressure to keep the crankshaft gear timed. And then we will loosen our head bolts in this order. It's very important that you do it in this order as not to warp the head. I would do it a quarter to a half of a turn at a time until they're all loose, and then you can take them out at will, and then the head will come off. Alright, just because I'm overly cautious, I went ahead and zip tied it against this upper power steering hose, or air conditioning hose, excuse me, just to kind of keep tension on it because I don't want it slipping off on the bottom. So anyways, yeah, now we're going to take these bolts out and this head's coming off. Have you ever wondered why they tell you not to use torque to yield bolts twice? Well, it's because they break. I've just come to the realization that this is not the first time this head's been off of this car. And there's a few clues along the way, a few odd size nuts on the exhaust and a few missing bolts holding some things on down here. The missing bolts holding the power steering pump on, and a broken off head bolt. Interesting that the head gasket would fail missing a head bolt, especially with whatever genius did this job last. Well, guess it's a good thing we're here. Hopefully we can salvage this motor. Alright, head bolts out. Do one last look around and make sure nothing's attached. For instance, this little plate right here, held on by a couple 10mm bolts. We'll detach that and then we'll bust this head out of here. Success! She came off. Now if you can't tell, somebody's tried to do this before and they left us a little present. Look at that! That might be the reason for our failure. In fact, I almost guarantee it. And they probably didn't get the head checked or decked. But there we are. So I'll get this cleaned up, get that head to the machine shop, have it checked out, have it milled if necessary, and I'll work on getting that stud out. So we're ready to put this back together. So I got our head back from the machine shop. They made sure it was flat, made sure it held vacuum and everything of that nature. In this case, the head that came off this wasn't actually salvageable at all. It was twisted, so warped that it was twisted and was not able to be salvaged. It was warped, I think they said 19 thousandths, which is way more than is able to be fixed. So I ended up having to source another one from, it actually took me a while. I had to get one out of Portland. I'm down here in Idaho, so it took a little bit. Now for this, what we're doing here is we just want to make sure that we clean this up, get the surface nice and clean, nice and flat. There'll be some gasket surfaces, the gasket that gets stuck on the metal on the surface here. So What I'm doing at this point is with some brake clean, high quality brake clean, doesn't leave any residue, as well as a razor blade, and my weapon of choice is always been a green Scotch-Brite. The plastic green Scotch-Brites that you can just buy, at Walmart, a dollar store, or whatever. Just the green part, not the whole sponge and the whole deal, but you can get them, they're cheap. I usually cut those up into fourths, and I'll use those lightly. The important thing here on matting surfaces of any sort, that's what I use to clean everything. With a razor blade, you want to be kind of at an angle, almost like a 45. Don't push too hard, but just kind of go over it all. It's kind of hard to see, but you kind of just go over it all, make sure that there's no high spots with the gasket. If so, this will scrape them off. I've already kind of gone over most of this, and I found a few high spots over here that I was just cleaning up. After the fact, I'll go over it lightly being the operative word, with the Scotch-Brite. You don't want to dig in, you don't want to focus too much on one area. Lightly go over it with the Scotch-Brite. You can try it a little bit dry, mostly wet with the brake clean, and it will clean it up, and you can actually feel it with your finger. Sometimes you'll get it all the way shiny. Sometimes it's going to leave some discoloration from the previous gasket, and that's fine as long as it is flat. As long as you can't feel a raised edge, as long as it's clean, as long as there's no oil. After you get it cleaned up, you'll want to get a clean rag or a clean shop towel and spray it with brake clean. Go over it one more time, wipe it down, make sure there's no oil, no grease, no remaining particles. Give it a once over, make sure it's clean, and then we're ready to put the head on. On the head side, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to be much more careful. Most of the time, if you get it back from the machine shop, they're already ready to go, they're already cleaned. The one that I have, that I got, was already flat, so they didn't need to mill it. So I'll be going over it very lightly, just making sure that it's clean as well. And then our gasket will go on, and we'll go from there with our torquing sequence and everything. So, alright, so we're all clean. Well, as clean as this one's gonna get at the time being. It's all flat, it's all flush. I've checked it. One thing to note, especially on this motor, some motors are worse than others, but on this one, you've got these big oil jackets that the oil returns back to the main pan. You can do one of two things with those. You can either plug them beforehand, before you start going at it, cleaning it up. You don't want debris and stuff to get down in there and get stuck in those walls. You can either plug it up with some paper towels or rags or whatever you'd like to do before you start cleaning, or if you didn't, then just make sure that you spray them down real good and make sure that there's no debris hanging out in the walls of those. In this case, I wasn't overly concerned with the coolant jackets are these smaller oblong shaped ones around, and the oil jackets are these big ones. I wasn't too concerned because me being overly cautious after this has had oil and coolant all mixed together inside the motor, before I even started, I'm going to be flushing the coolant system and obviously flushing the oil, dropping the oil and redoing it, new filter and the whole deal. And I'd recommend you do the same, but that's up to you. But yeah, this is clean enough here. So, there's a few dark spots where you can kind of still see that gasket, but, just make sure that it's flat, make sure there's no lip. Go over it with your fingernail. If you feel anything, keep cleaning. Just make sure that it's flat is the most important thing. Flat and clean. Make sure that you don't get any, leave any lint behind, from your rag or anything like that. Just kind of go over it. You might want to shoot it out with some air. I would, with your brake clean and with air, I would make sure that your threads are clean beforehand for your head bolts and things as well. Now for this build, I went ahead and got brand new head bolts, and I'd recommend you do the same. These are torque to yield bolts, from what I can tell. One of them was already broken when I took this motor apart. It looks like somebody had been in here and tried to do this once before. Unfortunately, they did a really bad job. Reused the bolts, broke one of them. The head was so warped to begin with that it wouldn't have taken either way. But such is life, and my life is fixing other mechanics' mistakes most of the time. Contrary to what the keyboard warriors say in the comments, I have been doing this for a while, and the techniques that I use have worked for me. I've never had to redo a head gasket in the many years that I've done many of them. So anyways, I'm going to get the gasket on here. I'm going to get the head cleaned up, and we'll put this on and we'll go over the torque sequence. Alright, just wanted to show you the proper way that this sets on here. Just make sure that when you put it on, all the holes line up. It'll only go on one way where all the holes line up. You can invert it accidentally and block off half of these oil return lines. So just make sure you got it on there right. Make sure that your thread holes are dry. You don't want to be tightening it down and have oil or garbage squirt up in between the gasket. Alright, here's the head all ready to go on. Now one thing to note is that if you have to completely replace the head like I did with a used one, you want to make sure that you throw the sprocket on, just or keep an eye on where this little dowel is without it. But just essentially make sure that this is at least close to your timing mark before you put it on, because if you put it on and you have to make a full rotation, remember that you're at top dead center, and if these valves on 1 or 4 need to open to make a rotation, it's not going to be a good day. You'll have to take it apart again to do it. So just make sure that you're close. In this case, it's spring loaded right here. It's about to open cylinder 2 valves, so it's close enough for me where if once I put it on, I can rotate that just a hair, enough to get it where I need it to be without interfering the 1 or 4 valves. So I'm about to put this on right now. While our head is on, there are dowels. I should have showed you before, but there are dowels in this bottom corner and the right corner that help it line up. If you do it like I did, where you left all this attached, you will have to kind of fish the that little pipe fitting underneath that plate on the intake manifold to get it to seat. But it's seated, and if you peek down in, you can kind of see, sorry my lighting's a little off, you can see that all of our holes line up. Okay, so according to the factory service manual, you can measure the bolt, and if it's within spec, you can reuse. I wouldn't recommend that. Anytime that you use torque to yield bolts, always a good idea to replace them. They weren't expensive. I think I paid 30 bucks for a whole set. So the next step is make sure that you apply a small amount of engine oil to the threads and to the washer on each bolt. The way that I do that is I'll usually have just a quart of oil. I'll dip the threads in there. I'll use a rag to wipe off the excess, and then make sure that I skiff the washer with oil. And then we'll put them all in. I'm going to set them all into place in each one of the cylinder bolt holes. Okay, so after we get the bolts in the holes, here's what the factory service manual says. So there's a certain order to tighten them in, as you can see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Basically just make sure that you're not doing two next to each other. It's super important when you're doing head bolts to do it in the exact order that the factory service manual says. So make sure that you follow this exactly. The steps are to tighten in order 55 plus or minus 3 foot-pounds, and then fully loosen them all in reverse order, and then tighten them all again 15 or 16 foot-pounds again. Then you can mark the head if you'd like. I don't do that just because I've been doing this a while, but then you're going to tighten in order 90 degrees, and then you're going to tighten in order 90 degrees again. So if that makes sense, so basically you're going to tighten them all to 55 foot-pounds, fully loosen them, and then retighten them all to 15 foot-pounds. Then you're going to go 90 degrees in order. You're going to start back at 1 and go 90 degrees in order again. So for a total of 180 degrees. But you can't just go 180 degrees all at once. You have to do it in order just like this for it to seal properly. Okay, so I've done steps 1 through 3, which is to tighten all the bolts to 55 foot-pounds in order, and then fully loosen them in reverse order. And when it says fully loosen, it means to take the pressure off. So it's usually about 180 degrees or 360 degrees off, just so that they're kind of loose spinning. And then retighten to 15 foot-pounds. So at this point, we're going to do the 90 degrees and the 90 degrees again. And I'd like to show you what that looks like. I don't have a second pair of hands, so I can't record me doing it. But essentially what you'll want to do is put your wrench up and down like this, and then you're going to tighten, boom, 90 degrees. Go to the next one, do the same thing. And then, boom, 90 degrees. And then when you come back around, you'll just set it on there and do it again, 90 degrees. And that's it. And then you're done with your head bolts. Now, with that being said, it's a short handle, so I like to use a pipe to give me some leverage. And I'll be back once I'm done with that. Alright, so our head bolts are all in. One thing to note, just so that you don't think it's weird, with a torque to yield bolt, when you're doing that second 90-degree turn, right at the very end, it's almost going to feel like the bolt gave out. That's the bolt stretching. It's normal. Super important though, don't go past the second 90 degrees, so 180 degrees total. You don't want to go past that. So you'll feel the bolt kind of stretch right there at the end. That's normal. From here, it's basically reverse of disassembly, excuse me. So just make sure that you get those two little bolts done right behind that timing belt again that we had to take off earlier. And then you should be, if you're keeping your timing belt, you should be able to just throw this right back on. I'll be replacing this timing belt at a later date, probably in a month or so. So I just got to get this out of the shop that I'm using at the moment for another project in the meantime. But timing belt video will be coming soon. For this case, to put this back on, you should be able to line that dowel up. I had to barely inch the crank pulley just a little bit so that dowel would line up, and I was able to get the bolt threaded, and it popped back into place where it's supposed to be. We'll cut those zip ties, of course, in a minute, but yeah, we're going to put it all back together, reverse of disassembly. I'll cut back in a few times just to show you the bolt torques on a few of the things like the intake exhaust and the valve cover. Otherwise, just put it all back the way you found it. Make sure everything goes smooth. All put back together. As you saw on that previous slide, I put the torque specs for the intake and exhaust and the valve cover, or rocker cover as it's also called. Put everything back together over here. Make sure that you rerun all your electrical. We had to put our tensioner slash power steering bracket back on. Looks like the previous owner is missing a bolt or two on this, so I'll go to the hardware store and get a couple of those. Now everything else is put back together, plugged in. I put everything back together, plugged in down here, as well as put the intake air box back in. So at this point, all that's left to do is change the oil, flush the coolant out, put new coolant in, and fire it up. Well, it's alive. Once you get it started, obviously just kind of go around and look for any leaks anywhere that you're putting it in together. Make sure you're not leaking coolant. This one has a little bit down there from before. I saw it before when I was putting it together, so that's not new, luckily. Look underneath the car, make sure that everything looks good. And that'll do it for this episode of Alan Fixed It. Go ahead and let it run for a minute, shut it off, and check your coolant again and your oil again, and make sure you turn your heat on full blast and make sure you're circulating that coolant all the way through the system. Make sure you don't get any air bubbles. And that's about it. Good luck on your endeavors.